Everyone, welcome back to episode 6 of Demand Decoded. Episode 6 already, blimey. This live event series decodes the secrets of successful B2B marketing, and we're Blend, a B2B website and demand generation agency. Thanks for joining us for episode 6. We appreciate you taking the time to watch and listen, whether that's live or on a podcast or YouTube. Just thanks for being here, really, and listening to us and learning. I'm with Phil, as usual, today. And we'll be diving into the evolution of buyer preferences and how you can adapt your marketing to serve these changes. And hopefully, by the end of this episode, you'll understand how buyer preferences have actually changed, understand what's caused those changes, so you can kind of understand the nuances that go behind buyer thoughts and that kind of thing. And you'll know how to adapt your strategy to better resonate with today's buyers. And as usual, feel free to pop any questions in the comments on LinkedIn, and then we can bring them up as we go along live. It's great to get a few to, kind of give you any individual insight that you need and, just spark some conversation. So feel free, if you have any questions, pop them in. So I think, obviously the first thing that we should talk about is how buyer behavior has actually changed. And I think, a good way to look at this is to go as far back as, reasonable, and to really look at the buyer evolution and the evolution of knowledge, actually. Because before, the internet and the digital age, there was a huge knowledge shift. So, before the times of websites, all of the knowledge for, products and services and solutions were with vendors. So it was only natural for buyers to have to reach out to vendors quite early in the process to understand and learn and educate themselves on, what might be the best thing for them, the best product, the best solution for them. And they would have to trust whatever that vendor was telling them at that point in time, because there were no better sources of information out there. It was merely just what that salesperson was telling you, or, that advice that you were getting from that vendor. Whereas, you look from 2000 and beyond, probably, in the digital buying era, and information is everywhere, especially from, 2010 onwards, really, when blogging and other types of content marketing really became popular, that information is so widespread now that actually, looking at the knowledge transfer, the knowledge is just with buyers now. They have more knowledge than anyone because they have so much access to content and information. It's unbelievable, really.
That's right. And as a result of the ongoing shift of that availability of knowledge and the sort of willingness of buyers to engage with the sales part of your business at different stages in the process, we've arrived at a point where the behavior of a buyer is very different from how it was, and is continually shifting increasingly towards these modes where really we see them, holding on to control of the process, something marketers have talked about for a long time, but they really are exercising this ability now. And it's produced a set of buyer behaviors that if you're not aware of and alert to and responding to, then you're increasingly going to be marketing to anybody but your buyer and generating a lot of leads that won't go on to close and so on. And for reasons that are connected to what you've just described and that we'll go into in a moment, the situation today is that buyers are, as reported not just by us but by Gartner and others, they're doing much more of the purchase process independently, meaning they're sourcing and consuming information anonymously, privately, without giving up their details, without entering lead pool, without converting to download stuff that they know they can get elsewhere freely. They're acting in a very unpredictable, non-linear manner. So, you can't build a model of the funnel, as it were, and expect each and every buyer that eventually does buy to follow the steps as you precisely describe them. It doesn't happen in that linear direction. They're doing different parts of the research process at a completely unpredictable rate, going backwards and forwards in ways you would never have expected. and not at all in a linear fashion. They've got more ways and places to find and discover and consume information than ever before, and they use them. And that's part of what I think is a symbiotic relationship between the landscape that buyers are in and the buyer behaviors, which tend to push one another along to a degree. We might talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment, but they are not just talking to salespeople or downloading ebooks and white papers or receiving newsletters. There are far more ways and places to find them and reach them. As I said, privacy is a concern for everybody, and at the same time, they know what the impact of giving that up is. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then, finally, salespeople, sales processes are still very important, but they are reserved now for the very last part of the purchase process, because they have been, to a certain degree, over many years, burned. Let's face it, by what salespeople and advertisers say, which is not always in their best interests, completely impartial or truthful. Now, I know that everybody watching is always impartial, truthful, and acts in their buyer's best interests, but en masse, buyers' experience of marketing, advertising, and sales is not necessarily that. So it has meant that they've shifted away from trusting and engaging with them earlier.
Yeah, I think a lot goes into that, actually, that, like you kind of just described, the content consumption evolution as well. It's like buyers don't rely on vendors for information anymore. So actually having to reach out to them to find out something, they don't really need to do it, because they can just find it somewhere else, whether that's on, that particular company's website, or just a quick Google search, or, in any other place where they consume content, they can just find that information out. So yeah, buyers are just avoiding talking to sales because they don't want to be sold to until the moment where they want to be sold to, which is the last possible thing.
And that's a product, I think, of this cycle, which is, buyers demonstrate a behavior, which is the product of some set of influences and stimuluses they receive. And then technology adapts to sort of facilitate that behavior. Then we try to monetize and saturate that new technology, and behavior moves on again. So, the fact that, buyers are now seeking content outside of the conversation with sales is the product of experiences they've had, and it's now enabled by technology. And for a while there, we adopted a kind of halfway house where, very common to gate the content, get the contact details, which is still kind of holding on to that information to a degree. And it worked for a while, perhaps, but buyer behavior moved on again, which is to say that they're not willing, as they were once, to give up their contact details. Although it's not equivalent to talking to sales, it's entering your sort of, it's becoming known to you, and that's a risk they're no longer prepared to take until they're absolutely sure that you or a small number of businesses like you are going to get their purchase at the end of the day, and that's when they'll reveal themselves.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think that is quite well known now. Like, people understand that buyer behavior has changed. It's well documented, like you said, by Gartner, by huge companies, really, in surveys and customer research, and, people talking to their own customers and understanding how they buy. But I actually think understanding why that has happened and why those individual changes we just spoke about actually came about really gives you insight into what you should be doing now as well, because you understand why that shift has happened, and you kind of get in the mind of these buyers a bit.
Yeah, well, it's all the product of experience, right? And one of the bigger, more recent changes in buyer behavior is this reluctance to convert, right? Reluctance to download or convert on a form, for example, to download content. And for a brief moment, filling in a form to download a piece of content was a way to gain access to really useful information that wasn't available elsewhere. But nowadays we all know that that's very often not the case. What you download as a result of filling in a form and giving up your privacy and your contact details, most often isn't groundbreaking. Most often isn't deeper or more actionable or more, impartial than anything you can find online. So it's become an unrewarding experience for buyers to fill in that form to get that ebook, because what they get isn't all that great. Now, there are people out there who've always written content that goes above and beyond the norm and the average, but too often the result was lackluster, and so buyer behavior shifted away from that. So one of the main reasons that we're seeing that happen is because over a long period of time, the content that people experienced as a result wasn't offering them the value that it should, or it could, or it once did. So it's driving the shift away from doing it. Not to, and that's even before we get onto the subject of what happens after, because of course the notion is that we convert someone into a contact using content so that we can very respectfully, very helpfully cajole them along the sales process somehow, the purchase process, send them more content that's relative to their very predictable place in the purchase journey, which is, as we've discussed, no longer really possible, if it ever was. And basically buyers know that now, if they do convert on a form in order to receive a piece of content or something like it, they are going to get email spam, which is basically the best thing you can really call nurturing emails these days, let's face it.
I was going to say, is that a reference to nurturing emails here, or actual spam? But, are they the same thing?
I think once a channel like email becomes saturated, automated, and optimized, it loses its cutting edge efficacy, right? So nurturing email, most of it goes unread, most of it's filtered out by technology, most of it's deleted. So we resort then to the in-mails, we go to the source, as it were, but nobody wants to receive those, truth be told. The hit rate on those has got to be absolutely infinitesimal. So then we hit the phones and we call the people that downloaded the content. Either we got their phone number if we were, that way inclined, or we source it from some other party and we call them. Buyers want none of those things until they're ready. So yet again, there's another driving force behind them not converting, not entering the lead pool, and staying anonymous and only consuming content that's freely publicly available until the purchase decision is, as near as done. So this is a very significant and irreversible set of drivers that are changing buyer behavior into what we see today.
Yeah. And, when you look at that, the process that they go on, the access to more information means that buyers don't have to follow a linear process. They're not downloading your piece of content and waiting for your 5-step email nurture sequence to learn about your product. If they want to learn, they'll go onto your website and have a look, explore in their own ways, or ask their peers, or consume the information in whatever way is preferable to them.
Yeah.
They're not going to wait 14 days to receive 5 emails and consume them all in perfect order. The process just doesn't work like that, because people operate in different ways. We're not robots, we're human.
Yeah, and they're never disconnected from the vast array of stimulus and ideas that are being presented all the time, right? People don't sit down to solve one problem and turn off everything else that's going on. So it's not like work happens in a linear form most of the time anymore. So neither does problem solving and the purchase decision. It's really, it can be quite stop-start for buyers. They're not focused on it exclusively. A new potential solution or opportunity can present itself at any time during the process, take them right back to the beginning, and everybody that they want to engage with will have a different process and methodology for it. So lots of very, very different paths to go on as they try and make a purchase decision. So yeah, really highly non-linear anymore.
Yeah. And, as we kind of alluded to at the start, buyers consume content in many different ways now. And this is one I think we spent a long time kind of discussing recently, which is kind of, the content consumption evolution, and trying to kind of understand why this has happened. And I think really it's just like, because there are more ways to access content and hang out in those places. And, the evolution of kind of apps like TikTok and things like that allow you to consume content so easily and it's readily available, just makes it easy.
But again, there's a connection between sort of technology and the human psyche, I suppose. Humans are social animals, and of course social platforms like LinkedIn and Facebook and TikTok satisfy a need for humans. We're probably straying too far into psychology, but ultimately people spend time there. There's not necessarily any really great reason for them to do so other than they want to, they like to. But what's happened is those are now the water holes where you can find people convening and you can have conversations that stimulate ideas and create great things, which is a perfect place to essentially create demand for something. The risk to those things is how much and how hard they get monetized, right? If a platform or a channel like that is, I guess, over leveraged by its owner, then you're suddenly past the prime of it as a place where you can, by doing good work, by creating good things, be they content or messages or experiences, you can generate a good reaction. We always have to be wary, and I think several platforms have seen the effect of that take away some of their efficacy. But for the time being, those are places where your buyers are hanging out, spending time voluntarily, and you can, if you're careful, become part of their consciousness and discussion without being overly salesy, which is a big push off for them now because they're so reluctant to be sold to, as we've discussed.
Yeah. And, as part of that content consumption evolution, it's just so easy to consume content now. Like you kind of said before, we are social animals and we just go on these apps because we want to. And, as businesses, if we are there in these places at the right time, producing valuable content that people want to consume, they will consume it.
Yeah, and in the format that can be that's optimized for the place. So putting a link to your blog post isn't going to work terribly well on a platform like LinkedIn, but creating a snapshot of the key takeaway, a carousel or an infographic, a short video that can be played natively, all those things are great ways to make yourself known and understood by your community of buyers. Again, whilst they're part of that vast majority of your addressable market that are not in purchase mode, which is where you go and how you go about creating demand in the first place.
Yeah. And, just carrying on the content evolution, the kind of bar that's been set now to actually create content and publish it has gone up so many levels since, social media was first a thing, that buyers just sit in these places and consume content because the amount of value that you get just scrolling through your LinkedIn feed is unbelievable. You don't have to go to website/blog or subscribe to a newsletter now to be able to get any kind of long form value. You can literally just scroll through YouTube or listen to a podcast or your social feed, or there are so many ways now to consume brilliant content because the bar has been set so high that people are just raising it, and buyers can then just consume all of that great content. And ultimately that's why it's evolved so massively.
I think there are phases of a purchase, and then the early phase is really a non-purchase part of the process, but ultimately it's about being open to and exposed to lots of potential solutions to your problems. Lots of ways to generate additional pipeline, lots of ways to attract buyers, lots of ways to solve all your problems. And social is a great place to see a lot of those things in a very digestible format. Now, when it gets down to like really researching whether one or more of them are going to solve your problem the way you need and want, that's when the website and more, shall we say, traditional forms of content probably have an increased value. And then eventually they will move on to contacting your or entering your sales process as a result of having reassured themselves that what you offer is close, if not, perfect match for what they need. So as we go through that purchase process, you find that different types of content play a different role, don't they?
Exactly. So what about privacy? Obviously, you said before, privacy is on buyers' minds more than ever, and they value it more than ever. But I suppose, what are the reasons why it's led to be that way?
Well, I think that's a two-sided thing. One is simply the awareness we all have around the vulnerability that our private data is under when we hand it over willingly to companies who, through no fault of their own, are probably incapable of protecting it against all threats. Breaches are everywhere, and it just as often it's very big companies who have immensely sophisticated cybersecurity measures in place, as well as it typically isn't small companies that you hear about as much. But ultimately, data isn't safe when you give it away, when it's on servers over here and in systems over there. So I think everybody, subconsciously or consciously, has a privacy concern right now, because of course personal data being stolen can potentially lead to increasingly serious consequences. If your identity is stolen, then that can really, really cause trouble and harm you. So everyone's thinking in a way that I think is conscious of the privacy risks. And then to add to that, there's this fact that if a buyer gives away their privacy to 10 or 20 vendors as they're going through the early research phase, they just know what's going to happen. They know their inbox is going to be flooded with automated and occasionally the odd manual email. Their LinkedIn inbox is going to fill up. The contact requests are going to come and quickly be followed up with the, let's talk about the solution. And, more often than not, the phone will start ringing. And, we have known for a long time that buyers are not receptive to those types of outreach. The conversion rate from them is in the low single decimal place digits. I think the last report I read was it was less than 0.1% or something ridiculous. So you're having to make thousands of connections, thousands, to get through once. It's a pretty clear indicator that buyers are not relishing that method. So I think for those two reasons, giving up contact details is less, much less freely done by the buyers as they're going through the process. For those two reasons.
How do you think the kind of like publicity of data breaches and that kind of thing is affecting buyers being aware of their privacy? Because I think it's definitely had an impact. There's people that I know that would have never ever thought about how their data is being accessed by multiple companies in ways like never before, and all of a sudden because it's on the news every now and again now about these huge data breaches, buyers are just so much more aware that this stuff is happening.
Well, I mean, I think it's vitally important that they are aware, because if you think how sort of freely we've been distributing bits of our personal information and our identity, it's quite scary, really. Now, don't get me wrong, buyers and people in general will still continue to do things at a high volume. Take, accepting cookies on websites. How many of us just instantly click accept all despite the fact that that banner has been put there in an effort to give us control over our privacy. So it doesn't bring about an overnight end to a behavior. But, speaking as a, citizen of the world and somebody who's, as vulnerable to this as anybody else, I think it's important that data breaches are made public and people are aware. And I think it's important that everybody looks after their digital privacy. And therefore, I think it's great that buyers do. And I think it's necessary for us to adapt and align to that. And that's just the way it's going to be going forward, unless there are major changes in the way that privacy is secured by companies. But I haven't seen anything lately that suggests it will be.
No. Okay. So after all of those, the evolution of buyer preferences, what are, now some of the ways that you can adapt your strategy to better resonate with today's buyers?
So if you stop for a moment and you think about what your buyers like and dislike, and you analyze what actually goes on before somebody becomes a customer, then you can get a pretty clear indication of how to align the marketing you do to the journey they want to take. And the journey they don't want to take is pretty clear. They don't want to fill in a form, to download an ebook, to receive 3 automated emails, to be scored and then phone called. What they do want to do is have access to the information that they need to make a decision freely, publicly, not be coerced into converting and becoming a lead and downloading it. And everybody's looking to build affinity with another party. So by giving your buyer this content, this knowledge, what freely, publishing it, in an ungated format on your website so that it can be found, so that it can then also be repurposed and atomized and packaged for the other places that they go to consume content and research. You can help them build affinity with you over and above any other brands that they don't get the same value from or don't experience at all as they go through the process. And you can get them to the point where they're willing to spend some time potentially on your website, really researching whether the product, service or solution you offer meets some or all of the requirements they have. And then you can get them to the point where potentially they will take an action that you offer them on your website to indicate their interest, to reveal themselves to you in a way that correlates, with a degree of qualification, and they can buy, they're likely to buy, they have a high intent to purchase something, and they're prepared to give you their identity, please look after it, and time to either talk to your sales team, go through a demo process, trial the software, but ultimately, hopefully, enter the pipeline and become a customer.
Yeah. I think through all of the changes we've just spoken about, actually the one thing that we're telling people to stop doing is stop getting leads. Like, stop trying to capture details too early before a buyer is ready to give it to you. That's the main, strategy change that you have to do here. Yeah. Let buyers be anonymous for as long as they want to be. Let them keep their privacy and stay in control of the journey like they want to be up until the exact point they're ready to talk to you and hand over those details. So, really the strategy change is stop creating leads too early. Stop trying to manipulate buyers into giving over their details before they're ready to do so you can try and market to them and sell to them when they don't want to be marketed to and sold to, and start focusing on creating high intent opportunities. That is, high intent conversions, basically when a buyer is saying, hi, can I talk to you? Because if you optimize around that, if everything you're doing is focused on that thing, then everything you do before that to get a buyer to that point is probably going to align with these changes in preferences.
Yeah, absolutely. If you optimize for the things that produce high intent conversions, qualified, interested buyers willingly entering the sales process, and not for creating leads, then you're going to be aligning to the buyer's preferences for the process. And I think, as well, if you've written or have the ability to write a piece of content which is genuinely good enough to help a buyer make an informed decision, then you absolutely have to publish it, openly, because buyers won't take the risk of downloading it, so they'll never see it if it is good enough. And you need the world to know that you are writing that content that is good enough. If you're one of the thousands of businesses that are ultimately trying to, I suppose, optimize that channel, shortcut the process, really rush out content that isn't actionable, isn't valuable, and put it behind a gate so that you can generate a lead, buyers are savvy to that now. They're savvy to it, and they're not going to allow it to happen to them. So you've got to get it out there and show it to the world. And then when you do, the results, the benefits are, they're kind of self-fulfilling in an essence. It's out there. People can see it. People can see that you mean well. You're doing good work. You're credible, and you'll reap the rewards of that.
Yeah. And, I think in terms of adapting your strategy, it's absolutely crucial to understand how your buyers want to consume content and learn and gather information about, what they're trying to achieve. And you have to be producing content in those formats, in those ways. It's no good just kind of guessing and maybe, picking up the latest trend that's happening, because if that doesn't relate to your buyer, then it's no good really doing it. You have to do the things that they want you to do and do more of them. If it's working, don't stop. Don't, pick up the latest thing. If you're blogging and your blogging is, converting highly and, buyers are finding that content useful, don't then, start another tactic or in another channel, maximize where you are and what's working before you move on to the next thing.
Yeah, it can be challenging, and we've seen this in communities that we're part of, and relationships that we've had at the agency and all sorts of different places. But it can be hard for marketers to sort of accept some of these more fundamental changes necessary. It can take a long time to bring people around to the idea that actually what they've been told to do or what they've learned to do is no longer the way. Sometimes very quick, but in some situations it's a very slow process. It takes a long time. But I do wish marketers would spend more time, introspectively looking at themselves in the sort of metaphorical mirror and saying, well, what is it that I as a buyer respond to? And what is it that I as a buyer avoid, dislike, and how much is that reflected in the marketing I'm doing to my business's buyer? Because I find it really interesting that we all have largely similar preferences for how we engage with content and with companies. But when we come into work and sit down at our desk as a marketer, we put all of that aside. And
it is bizarre, isn't it? Yeah, it's so true that
a mass of time and money trying to optimize a channel that we know in the back of our mind is completely ineffective at turning us into customers of organizations. So, I do encourage people to stop and think about themselves usually as a pretty good example of what their buyer will like and dislike.
Yeah, or at least there is likely to be, a particular subject matter expert that's been in your industry for, donkey's years, or maybe quite new, but somebody who's more in the industry. I'm just thinking back to past roles where I wasn't necessarily the subject matter expert, but there were people there that understood buyers very well, and them themselves had been a buyer in those positions. So there's likely to be people around you that you can ask and understand those preferences for.
Yeah, if you are smart enough to know that you can't necessarily trust your own, your own take on something like that, then you can definitely speak to others and get insights. Right, speaking to customers, of course, is a perfectly valid way to gather, insight into what they like. Got to be careful with how you structure the questions, because there's always degrees of bias that come into conversations like that. Like, what do you like and dislike about our marketing? But you're the person doing it, asking. So you've got to be careful to avoid, bias in the answers. But another topic we've talked on, self-reported attribution, so often tells you that the true source of interest in what you offer is not what you expected. It's not what you necessarily thought you were, optimizing for. So you can use a variety of methods and ways to gain the insight that will reassure you that shifting away from the older buyer journey model to the newer independent, private, anonymous method that we're talking about is the right way to go. There should be plenty of evidence for that around in your data, in your conversations that you can have with your audience, with your customer, in communities that you're a part of, and again, just in your own mind in terms of what works for you.
Yeah, and I mean, even outside of those conversations and your own thoughts, there is published information on this by the likes of Gartner, who have a huge wealth of data on buyer behavior that, okay, take some of the stuff with a pinch of salt, but for the most part, the trends are all heading in the same direction, right? The changes are all published the same. So have a look at them.
Yeah, I mean, there are sometimes, inertia factors. You might have to change how your sales team, thinks about leads versus, qualified leads and so on. You might have to change how they're focused. You might have to change what you measure. You might have to win over, the hearts and minds of others. So there are things that create inertia in adopting this change. But yeah, largely speaking, it's widely spoken about. Lots of evidence for it. And if you can overcome that inertia, then you have an opportunity to really future-proof your marketing and grow better, if not faster, as a result.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should just, dive in slightly deeper, actually, to some of the potential challenges that you might face when, adapting to these modern buyer preferences, because you're going to have to change quite a lot of, your marketing tactics and strategies and sales and, business strategies at times to actually, pivot towards these buyer changes, buyer preference changes. So, yeah, it's really important to understand some of the challenges you're going to face along the way. You can't just, suddenly take all of your gated content and ungate it, and, stop producing leads and that kind of thing. Like,
yeah, ideally you would, right? But that will be the biggest change for mature companies that have established, ways of working. One of the most common barriers to overcome is that you're talking about a change in your marketing strategy that will produce a sudden significant drop in number of leads generated, and for lots of organizations, by proxy, number of MQLs artificially brought about by scoring. So you are potentially saying to your organization, we're going to generate a lot less leads and a lot less MQLs, but we're going to generate a higher quality and a higher quantity of, a higher quantity of high intent leads, but a much lower quantity overall. And of course, that can bring about a question, well, what will all of our SDRs do with their time if they're not being supplied with 50 fresh leads a day to call and email and sequence? What are they going to do? And that's probably for organizations that are in that situation, that's probably the bigger challenge or the bigger factor they've got to overcome. But as we discussed last time, there are organizations that have paved the way for us. They've overcome it. They've found ways to refocus the time and effort of their SDRs away from the leads that they used to receive and call, and get everybody excited about the opportunity that only talking to people who want to talk to you presents in terms of sales velocity, average customer value, and just close rate, which will be far, far higher from that smaller pool of truly interested buyers, as opposed to the very large pool of relatively disinterested leads that you used to call.
Yeah, absolutely. And aside from, some of the larger changes that you have to make as part of your organization, the whole mind shift and, metrics and potential, sales structure shift, I actually, thinking back to, I think it was actually episode 1, gated versus ungated content. And somebody asked us, well, if I'm not gating my content, then how do I follow up with these people? Like there's a mental shift that marketers have to make here. It's strange. It's like, I'm not gating it. Like, well, how do I measure anything then? Like, what do I do? It's like, us as marketers actually have to take this leap of faith and, almost embrace these changes. And that's quite a mental shift sometimes.
The path to success as an organization isn't always the same path that can be measured precisely at every step along the way, and that's quite hard because businesses, thrive on measurability and performance metrics and feedback. But there are often counterintuitive things that create success, and that's a struggle for marketers because we've been conditioned to measure and optimize pretty much everything we do, over recent years. But ultimately, organizations should be aligned around growth and revenue, things that produce revenue. Ultimately, organizing and aligning sales around one metric and marketing around another metric that are either one or the other, not that, is potentially counterproductive in the long run, because you're getting your marketing team, to optimize all of their effort around something which doesn't necessarily correlate with the true thing that matters and the true thing that creates successful customers and the organization, which is, growth. So you are going to see, if you adopt a strategy that's aligned to modern buyer preferences, a shift in the things that you can measure and that you should measure. And we would advise that you look down the funnel. You look at high intent leads, which we call MQLs, just not the scored version.
Yeah.
Opportunities created and customers closed, and the things beyond that point, and use marketing metrics to inform your process, your creative process to a degree, in terms of what's resonating, what's working, what's creating engagement, but not use marketing metrics as a measure of success, because a measure of success in a marketing sense is probably, at odds with a measure of success in terms of sales and revenue.
Yeah. And, just kind of looking at a more granular tactical level, when you're trying to pivot your strategy towards changing buyer preferences, it will ultimately lead you to do new and different things and adopt new strategies and new tactics and try out new channels and those kind of things. And, the one thing I would just say is you don't have to perfect those things straight away. It's better to get started and learn as you go, and then, evolve and improve and iterate over time. But actually just getting started, whether if you're gating content at the moment, ungate it, put it in a pillar page and, see how then that affects your SEO over time. If you're not really active on LinkedIn, start posting on LinkedIn, like 1 to 3 times a week. It doesn't have to be, super duper branded, amazing looking creative. If the content resonates with your buyer and helps them and is informative, they're probably going to like it and engage with it over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say there's a guiding principle that I use and I encourage, which is to wherever you're looking at the customer journey at any point in time in your marketing, estate, optimize the place you're in for the buyer at the stage they're at. Let me rephrase that because I didn't come across totally clearly. The customer journey is kind of a continuum. It's not a linear continuum, but it ultimately is a continuum. And if you optimize content and the way you present it for the buyer in each instance, you can create the best customer journey possible. So, for example, you've got a potential buyer on your blog reading a blog post somehow, happy day. Don't go and clutter that blog with calls to action left, right, and center, social sharing buttons here, subscribe pop-ups over there, author tags, archives, profiles, don't do that stuff. Optimize for what the buyer's trying to accomplish at that moment, which is read the content. Move on to your website, which is usually going to be visited at a later stage in the purchase process, your homepage, your product, your services pages. Optimize the user experience, the navigation, the layout for the buyer at that point in time. Don't have whizzy sliders flying by. Don't go bananas with motion and animation if it doesn't help you get your message across. Don't put a burger navigation on your desktop website that actually impairs navigation and travel. Optimize for the buyer there. Optimize for the buyer on your pillar pages, on your blog posts, and optimize for the buyer on social. And you can remove a lot of the friction from the path to raising their hand and telling you they're interested.
Yeah. Just hearing the word slider and desktop burger menu is making me want to end this, right now, just because it sends shivers up my spine.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's handy actually that next week's episode is on website UX, isn't it? So I'm sure you'll dive into it more then. But
yeah. Well, whatever you're looking at any particular time, you should be putting the buyer's needs and preferences first, not your own, and making things easier for them, in the mode they're in, which is to say, a buyer is probably not on your website in that information gathering, idea gathering mode. So presenting information or designs that are aligned to that is quite often counterproductive to what they need and therefore what you're trying to achieve. So it's quite a simple guiding principle, as I've said, which if applied can actually make, the journey very painless and very effective at getting people to willingly, take that final all important step, which is to book that call with you if that's what you're offering.
Yeah. Okay. So on that point then, after somebody books that call with you or fills out that high intent form, whatever it may look like, whether it's book a demo, free trial, book a consultation, get in touch, whatever it may be, what are the kind of buyer preferences beyond the creation and capturing of that demand? Like, the kind of experience, I suppose, past marketing almost.
Well, I mean, there's probably a lot of variety in what works in different businesses and for different products and solutions there. But probably some holistic principles are that buyers desire responsivity, quick. Ultimately, everybody's time poor, information rich. If you get an inquiry from a buyer, then your ability to respond to it appropriately quickly is well known to correlate with success further on. And also, continuing the principle of removing friction from that process, making it easy to do what's required, not anything else. Trying to get buyers to do something else very easy that isn't aligned to their wish at that point in time is foolish. But making sure that your systems, your technology, your platform, is able to facilitate, quick response, quick follow-up when it's needed, a simple process to take the next step, which is, be a handover to an actual named sales rep who can reach out and can have the conversation. People increasingly don't really want to be bank qualified on a first call. So I say can have the conversation, meaning, somebody with the knowledge that's necessary. Or, for example, if it's a demo, I love solutions that facilitate somebody joining a demo instantaneously when they're ready, because this idea that you will fill in a form to schedule a demo for some time in the future is quite often a bit, doesn't go over terribly well with buyers. Whereas if you can make that demo immediately available, but it still have the qualities that a demo should have, that's really powerful. So remove friction, create speed, and keep it simple. An overly complicated sales process doesn't help anybody. Although the temptation with modern software is always to make things more and more complicated, but it's usually advisable to go in the other direction.
Yeah, and I think we've spoken about it before. Don't give in always to the temptation of shiny software like chatbots, meeting schedulers, things like that, because sometimes they can just impair the buyer experience, but also, sometimes the selling experience too.
They can have the opposite effect to the one you want them to have, which is, ultimately, they can quite often increase quantity but decrease quality, taking away structure from the purchase process. As I said, making the things that are necessary or desired by the buyer easy, but not other things. This is usually advisable. So yeah, by all means test. That I'm all for experimentation, but when something doesn't work, please don't be reluctant to turn it off just because it's exciting, shiny, or new. Right? Trust the data. Lean into what works, push it open doors, and you'll create greater results more quickly.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think on that note, we should probably wrap up episode 6.
All right.
So yeah, I mean, if you found this useful, as usual, we'd love to hear your feedback. Be sure to follow the Blend LinkedIn page for all the future events. Next week's is coming up and is on killer website UX tips, which I'm taking a back seat on for this one because, I'm not the expert here on website UX. I'm leaving that with Phil and Jasmine at Blend. So yeah, be sure to tune in for that. I certainly will. So I can't wait for that one. And you can watch any previous episode on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, basically any kind of place where you would ever consume content. Just search for Demand Decoded and you will probably find it there. So yeah, thanks for tuning in and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.